Emily was just 10 years old, but her life had already been shaped by events far beyond her age. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her mother, she often found solace in the company of her 4 K9s, German Shepherds that her father had trained before he was killed on a mission. The dogs, trained for police and military operations, were her best friends, her protectors, and in many ways, her family. Her mother, Sarah, was a woman of strength and resilience. After the loss of her husband, she worked hard to provide for Emily, but it was clear that her heart was still anchored to the past. Emily had been too young to fully understand the danger her father had faced, but she had grown up hearing stories of his bravery. She always felt his presence through the dogs, who seemed to carry his spirit with them. Every morning, before the sun was even up, Emily would head to the local park with her dogs. The early morning walks had become a ritual, a time for her to escape the world, even if just for a little while. It was there, in the quiet of the early hours, that she felt most connected to her father. The dogs would run freely, their sleek bodies cutting through the misty air, while Emily jogged alongside them, her laughter echoing in the stillness. But things were starting to change. Lately, the neighborhood had felt less safe. There had been whispers about a local gang, a group of bikers who had been causing trouble in the area. Emily had heard her mother talking about it in hushed tones with her friends, and though she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, she could feel a shift in the air. It wasn't the peaceful, serene world she had known. On one particular morning, Emily noticed something was off. The dogs were unusually alert, their ears pricked and eyes scanning the surroundings, as if something was lurking just beyond the corner of her vision. She kept her pace steady, but the sense of unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. As they made their way through the park, a loud engine roared in the distance. Emily looked up, spotting a group of bikers speeding down the road. They were dressed in black leather, their faces obscured by helmets, and their bikes growled as they passed. The air around them seemed to vibrate with danger. It was then that she first noticed them, the bikers slowing down, glancing at her as they passed. She felt a chill run down her spine. The dogs, ever the vigilant protectors, growled low in their throats. Emily tried to keep walking, but the feeling of being watched persisted. She knew she had to get home before they decided to approach. But fate had other plans. One of the bikers pulled up beside her, his bike rumbling to a stop just a few feet away. He removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face and eyes that gleamed with malice. His companions circled around her, blocking the path, their eyes fixed on Emily and the dogs. "Well, what do we have here?" the man said, his voice gravelly. "A little girl and her army of dogs." Emily's heart raced, but she stood tall. The dogs, sensing her fear, positioned themselves around her protectively. They weren't aggressive, but they were ready to defend. She remembered what her father had taught her: never back down in the face of fear. The biker smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "You think those dogs can protect you, little girl? Think again." Emily didn't say a word. She tightened her grip on the leash of her lead dog, Rex, a massive German Shepherd who was clearly the alpha of the pack. Rex growled low, a sound that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. He was always calm and controlled, but when it came to protecting her, nothing would stop him. "Move along, pal," Emily said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "You're not welcome here." The biker laughed, a cold, cruel laugh that made Emily's stomach turn. He revved his engine, the sound deafening in the quiet morning. "You should be careful, kid. This is our territory now." The group of bikers hovered, waiting for a sign, some form of response that would give them reason to escalate. Emily's dogs, sensing the tension, barked loudly, their warning sharp and clear. But before things could spiral out of control, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She quickly grabbed it, hoping for some distraction, and saw a text from her mother. "Emily, stay close. I'll be there soon. That small message brought a wave of relief, but it wasn't enough to shake the feeling of danger that lingered. Emily's hand trembled as she typed back a quick reply, but the bikers were still there, eyeing her and her dogs. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the bikers gunned their engines and sped off, leaving Emily standing in the park, her heart still pounding in her chest. She looked around, ensuring no one was lurking, before continuing her walk, her dogs now more vigilant than ever. But Emily knew deep down that this wasn't the last time she would encounter the bikers. Something told her that this encounter was just the beginning of a much darker story. And as she walked back home, the faint sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling that danger was coming, and this time, she wouldn't be able to run. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden light across the empty streets of the suburban neighborhood. Emily's feet tapped lightly against the pavement as she walked alongside her canines, each dog trotting beside her with an air of calm vigilance. Rex, the alpha, walked a few paces ahead, his alert ears twitching at every sound. The others, Bella, Max, and Luna, kept a close watch on their surroundings, as though instinctively knowing that something was different today. It had been a week since the bikers had first appeared in the park, and the uneasy feeling still lingered in Emily's chest. Though the days that followed had been calm, her mind kept returning to the biker gang that had circled around her. Something about that encounter didn't sit right. Her father's lessons of trust and caution echoed in her mind. Always be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her that danger wasn't far off. As they neared the park, Emily noticed something strange. A lone motorcycle parked by the entrance. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen any bikers this early before. She stopped, feeling the familiar tension creeping up her spine. The dog sensed it too. Rex growled softly, his golden eyes scanning the area ahead. Bella, Max, and Luna followed suit, their bodies stiff with alertness. A voice broke the silence, low and cold. "Well, well, if it isn't the little girl with the army of dogs." Emily turned slowly, her grip tightening around the leashes as she looked up. The man who had spoken was the same one from last time, the one who had mocked her and her dogs. The biker's face was even more sinister today. His eyes narrowed behind the dark sunglasses that shielded his gaze. The others from his gang were there too, circling around her like vultures, all their motorcycles lined up in a row, idling with a menacing hum. "We've been watching you, girl," the biker continued, stepping closer. "You think you're safe, don't you? With your little pack of dogs? We run this neighborhood now." Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension building in the air, the unmistakable sign of an impending confrontation. The dogs, sensing her anxiety, began to growl louder, their hackles raised. Rex, always the most composed, stood firm beside her, eyeing the bikers with a calculated, almost threatening gaze. He was ready. "I'm not afraid of you," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear that swirled inside her. "Leave us alone." The biker let out a low laugh, almost amused by her response. "Oh, you're not afraid, huh? Maybe you will be when you see what happens next." The biker signaled to one of his companions, who started revving his motorcycle engine. The others followed suit, their bikes roaring to life in an almost deafening symphony of noise. Emily could feel her heart racing. This wasn't just a few idle threats anymore. These people were looking for trouble, and she had no choice but to face them. With a sharp tug on the leash, Emily pulled Rex closer, positioning him in front of her like a shield. "Stay back," she warned, her eyes narrowing in determination. "I'll call the police if you don't leave." One of the bikers, a large man with a patched leather jacket, scoffed. "The police won't do anything. This is our turf, little girl. You're just a nuisance." He took a step forward, clearly intending to intimidate her, but as he did, Rex let out a loud, low growl that stopped him dead in his tracks. The biker hesitated, then took a cautious step back. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She was grateful for the dog's protection, but she knew that words wouldn't stop these people. Not this time. Suddenly, Emily heard a familiar sound. The screech of tires, the rapid approach of a vehicle. Her heart skipped, and she quickly turned, hoping it was someone who could help. To her relief, it was her Uncle Michael, pulling up in his truck. He was an imposing figure, his muscular build evident even from a distance. As a former Navy SEAL, Michael had been trained for moments like this, dangerous, unpredictable, and often violent. He didn't hesitate for a second as he parked the truck, his eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a soldier. He was here to make sure Emily was safe. The bikers turned, clearly surprised by his arrival. "What's this?" the leader sneered. "Her bodyguard?" Michael stepped out of the truck with a calm, controlled demeanor. "I wouldn't call it that," he said, his voice cold but steady. but you're about to find out just how dangerous it can be to mess with my niece." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, sizing him up. They hadn't expected a man like him to show up. They were used to intimidating people, not facing off with someone who had seen combat firsthand. "Well, well, looks like we've got a tough guy here," the leader said with a smirk, though his confidence was waning. "You think you can take all of us on?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned to Emily and the dogs. "Get in the truck," he said softly. Emily hesitated for a moment, looking at the bikers. She didn't want to leave. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not with Rex and the other dogs at her side. But Michael knew better. He wanted to end this confrontation before it escalated further. With a quick nod, Emily reluctantly backed away, pulling on the leashes to guide the dogs toward the truck. The bikers watched them closely, but they didn't make a move. Michael didn't take his eyes off the gang. He knew that this wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. As Emily climbed into the truck, she glanced back at the bikers. She was frightened, but she was also resolute. She wasn't going to let them scare her. And with Michael by her side, she knew they would face whatever came next together. The bikers slowly backed away, their engines rumbling as they turned their bikes around and rode off, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a temporary reprieve. Something told her that the bikers would be back, and when they did, it wouldn't be just another casual confrontation. As the truck pulled away, Emily sat quietly, her thoughts racing. She had never felt so close to danger, but at the same time, she had never felt so determined to protect herself and those she loved. The bikers would learn soon enough. No one messed with Emily and her canines, not on her watch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange hue across the quiet suburban street. Emily sat on the couch, her legs crossed, absently petting Rex, the alpha dog, as she tried to process everything that had happened that morning. The bikers had returned, and though they had backed off when her Uncle Michael appeared, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something about their cold laughter, the menacing looks, and the threat in their voices lingered in her mind. Rex's head rested gently on her lap, and she absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears. The dogs were usually so calm, but even they seemed on edge. Max, the smaller but fiercely loyal shepherd, had barely eaten his dinner. Bella and Luna had been pacing around the house, their usual energy replaced by an eerie vigilance. Emily understood. They were ready to protect her, as always, but even they could sense that something dangerous was lurking just around the corner. The faint sound of a truck engine rumbled outside, followed by the distinct screech of tires as it pulled into the driveway. Emily's heart lifted at the sound. It was Uncle Michael. She quickly stood up, her anxiety easing slightly as she ran to the door. Her uncle's truck, an old but reliable black pickup, had become a comforting sight. Michael wasn't just family. He was a protector, a soldier who had faced unimaginable threats during his years in the Navy SEALs. But Emily also knew he had a soft spot for her. He was the kind of man who would drop everything and come to her aid when needed. When she opened the door, she was met with Michael's warm smile. Even after all the years of hard service, he still had that air of quiet strength, his eyes sharp and calculating, but filled with the love and care of a devoted family member. He bent down to give her a hug, lifting her up off the ground for a brief moment. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. "I'm okay," Emily said, her voice quiet but grateful. "But those bikers, Uncle Mike, I'm scared they're going to come back. They said this was their turf." Michael's expression darkened for a moment, and he stood up straight, glancing toward the street. He had seen many dangerous situations in his life, but nothing made his protective instincts flare more than seeing someone threaten his niece. "Don't worry," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They might think they own this neighborhood, but they don't. They're just a bunch of bullies who picked the wrong person to mess with." Emily followed him as he walked into the living room. He looked over at the dogs, who were now gathered in the corner of the room, watching him closely. It was clear they recognized him as a member of the family and were waiting for his next move. "You're not alone in this, Em. Not now. Not ever," Michael continued, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But we're going to need to be smart about this." Emily nodded. "What do we do now?" Well, first, Michael said, taking off his jacket and hanging it up, we need to get things ready. I'm not going to let those bikers walk all over us. I've got a few things to set up, but while I'm doing that, I want you to stay close to me, and I need you to keep the dogs with you. If anything happens, they'll be your first line of defense. Emily felt a surge of determination course through her. She had always looked up to Michael. He had been the rock of their family after her father's death. He'd taught her a lot about being strong, about facing fear head-on, and now, with him back in town, she felt like she could take on anything. "I'll stay close, Uncle Mike," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "But what exactly are we going to do about those bikers? They'll be back, won't they?" Michael didn't answer right away. He walked to the kitchen counter, where a map of the neighborhood was laid out, and began marking some locations with a pen. Emily watched as he focused on the task, his mind clearly working through a plan. She had learned over the years that when Michael set his mind to something, he was unstoppable. "We're going to make sure they don't come back," he said, looking up from the map and meeting her gaze. "But we're going to do it the right way. We're going to let them know that we're not afraid and that we're not backing down." Emily's stomach twisted with a mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't sure what her uncle had planned, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be something they could handle together. She trusted him with her life. "Do you want to help me get ready?" Michael asked, his voice gentle but serious. "Of course," Emily said, feeling a sense of purpose fill her. She didn't need to be told twice. Together, they would figure out how to stop the bikers from terrorizing their neighborhood. As Michael continued his preparations, Emily spent the next few hours helping him set up some basic security measures around the house. They reinforced the doors and windows, making sure that no one could easily break in. She and Michael also went over the plan in detail, where each dog would be positioned, what Emily's role would be in case of an emergency, and how they would signal each other if things got out of hand. When the evening came, Michael's presence felt like a fortress around Emily. Despite the fear and uncertainty she had felt earlier in the day, she was now filled with a sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let anyone harm her, her family, or her dogs. And with Michael by her side, she knew they were ready to face whatever came their way. As night fell, Emily stood by the window, looking out into the darkened street. Her dogs lay silently at her feet, sensing her calmness, and she felt the warmth of her uncle's presence beside her. Tonight, they would be ready. Whatever the bikers had in mind, they wouldn't find an easy target. The first test of her resolve would soon come, and Emily wasn't going to back down. The night was unusually quiet. Emily sat in the living room, her eyes darting back and forth between the dark street outside and her Uncle Michael, who was sitting at the kitchen table, studying the map they'd spread out earlier. The tension in the house was palpable. Every noise seemed to stand out. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car engine, every rustle of wind outside. It felt like the calm before the storm, and Emily could sense that something was coming. She just hoped they were ready. Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. "All right, Em, this is what we're going to do. We've got a small window before they figure out we're onto them. If we're going to stop them, we need to take action tonight." Emily stood up from the couch, walking over to the table where her uncle was pointing at the map. "What's the plan?" she asked, eager to understand. Michael tapped a spot on the map, a street corner a few blocks away. "This is where they've been hanging around. We've seen them riding through here over the last couple of days. I've been keeping track of their movements." Emily leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she studied the location. "So we're going to confront them there?" "Exactly," Michael replied, his voice firm and steady. "But we're not going in blind. I've set up a few things around the house. Cameras, motion detectors, a few other surprises, just in case things go sideways. But the goal is to catch them off guard. We're going to show them we're not backing down." Emily's mind raced as she tried to digest the plan. She had always been taught to be cautious and smart about situations like this, but she had never imagined she would be taking the lead in something like this. Her uncle's presence was both reassuring and intimidating. He had seen combat. He knew how to fight, how to survive. And now he was putting his trust in her, in the K9s, and in their ability to protect themselves. "I can do this," she muttered to herself, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Michael stood up, his expression softening just for a moment. I know you can, Em. You've got more guts than most people twice your age. But remember, the dogs are our first line of defense. They're trained for situations like this. If things get ugly, I need you to keep them close." "I will," Emily said, her resolve hardening. She trusted her canines with her life, and she knew they would be ready to follow her lead. Michael walked to the front door and peered out into the street. The neighborhood looked peaceful, too peaceful. Emily knew that peace could be deceiving. The calm exterior masked the tension that was building just under the surface. He turned to her. "Stay sharp, Em. We need to move quickly. The element of surprise is our best advantage. If we're caught off guard, they'll overpower us. They've got the numbers, but we've got the training." Emily nodded. She was starting to understand the gravity of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a test of her ability to protect herself, her family, and her home. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would use the element of surprise to ambush the bikers in their own turf. Michael had been tracking the bikers' movements for the last few days, and he knew their typical routes. Emily and the canines would set up a perimeter, using the cover of night to their advantage. They would wait for the bikers to show up, and then Michael would make his move, taking out the leader and disorienting the others. The goal was to break their confidence, to show them that they weren't the ones in control. The canines had already been prepared. Rex, Max, Bella, and Luna had been given a quick training session earlier in the day to ensure they were ready for the task at hand. They knew the drill: stay close to Emily, watch for threats, and respond when given the signal. "All right," Michael said, walking over to the door. "Let's get moving. We don't have much time." Emily grabbed Rex's leash, and the two of them headed out into the night. The canines trotted at her side, their sharp eyes scanning the streets. They made their way to the corner of the street where the bikers had been spotted multiple times. The air was cool, and the only sound was the soft crunch of leaves underfoot as they walked toward their position. The area was eerily quiet as they took their places. Emily felt a nervous flutter in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady. Rex nudged her hand, sensing her anxiety, and she patted his head softly. "We've got this," she whispered to him. Michael moved into position behind a row of bushes near the street corner. He gave Emily a quick nod, signaling that he was ready. Emily had been trained by him to stay calm in these situations. But now, for the first time, she truly understood the importance of remaining composed. Every sound in the distance, every rustle of the leaves, made her heart race, but she focused on the task at hand. They waited. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. But Emily didn't waver. She trusted the plan. She trusted her dogs. And she trusted her uncle. Then, out of nowhere, the rumble of motorcycle engines broke the silence. The bikers were coming. Emily's stomach tightened, but she kept her eyes trained on the road. Rex growled softly, ready to spring into action. Michael was poised and still, waiting for the perfect moment. Emily could hear the bikes getting closer, the noise growing louder as they approached. She counted them, 6 motorcycles in total, just like before. "Now," Michael's voice came through the comms in her ear. "Let's do this." The moment he gave the signal, Emily tugged on the leash, sending Rex sprinting into the street. The canines followed suit, their powerful bodies charging toward the bikers. The element of surprise worked. 2 of the bikers, caught off guard, swerved and lost control of their bikes, crashing into a nearby tree. But the rest of the gang didn't panic. They gunned their engines, trying to regain control. One of them pulled out a crowbar, ready to swing it at Emily. But before he could strike, Michael emerged from the shadows, taking down the leader in a flash of motion. He had the element of surprise on his side, and the bikers knew immediately that this was not a fight they would win. The canines went into action, taking down one biker after another, their training kicking in. Max and Bella pinned 2 bikers to the ground, their jaws locked on their arms, while Luna and Rex flanked the others. Emily stayed close, keeping the dogs focused and making sure they didn't go too far. Within minutes, the bikers were disarmed and the fight was over. The leader, now on the ground, raised his hands in surrender, his face twisted in disbelief. Michael stood over him, his voice cold and commanding. "You picked the wrong neighborhood to mess with." As the police arrived and the bikers were handcuffed and loaded into the squad cars, Emily stood beside her uncle, her heart still racing. She had faced danger and come out victorious, But as she looked at the defeated bikers, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The night was still, the air cool and crisp, as the last of the police vehicles rolled away, leaving the quiet suburban street to return to its usual tranquility. Emily stood outside, her feet firmly planted on the porch as she watched the flashing lights fade into the distance. The bikers, now detained, were no longer a threat, at least not tonight. But Emily knew, deep down, that the danger wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't yet finished. Her uncle, Michael, stood beside her, his presence solid and comforting. The aftermath of their confrontation felt strange, almost surreal. Michael had always been the calm in the storm, and his ability to stay level-headed in moments of intense danger had never failed to impress her. But even now, she could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. "That went well," Michael said quietly, breaking the silence as he gazed down the street. He leaned against the porch railing, his posture relaxed but alert, always watching, always prepared. Emily took a deep breath, the adrenaline of the night still lingering in her body. "I can't believe it was that easy. I thought it would be harder." Michael turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've got more guts than most grown men, Em. You didn't hesitate. That's what made the difference." Emily nodded, though the thrill of victory felt somewhat hollow. She had faced danger and they had come out on top, but something about it all felt off. The bikers weren't just some random troublemakers. They were part of something bigger. She could feel it in the air. Something was lurking in the background, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was asking for reassurance or for the truth. Michael didn't immediately respond. He looked out over the neighborhood, the quiet hum of crickets filling the night air. After a moment, he sighed and finally spoke. "It's not over, kiddo. Those bikers might be down, but they're just pawns. Someone's pulling their strings, and that's who we need to be worried about." Emily's heart sank. The bikers had been menacing, yes, but she knew they weren't the true threat. There was something deeper, something more dangerous at play. Her instincts, honed over the years by her father's teachings and her uncle's guidance, told her that this was only the beginning. "We need to figure out who's behind this," Michael continued, his voice resolute. "And when we do, we'll be ready for them. We won't be caught off guard again." The confidence in his voice gave Emily some comfort, but she couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. It wasn't the bikers she was afraid of. It was the unknown, the dark shadows lurking just beyond her understanding. She had faced the immediate danger, but now, the real challenge lay in uncovering the truth. "I trust you, Uncle Mike," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be ready for whatever comes next." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare moment of tenderness. "I know you will be, but you've got to be smart about this. We're not dealing with amateurs anymore. Whoever's behind this won't hesitate to strike again if they think we're weak." Emily looked down at Rex, who was sitting at her feet, his eyes still watchful, his body relaxed but alert. The other dogs lay nearby, their calm presence a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. With them by her side, and with Michael's experience and guidance, she knew she could face whatever came next. "I won't let them get away with it," Emily said, her voice firm. "Whatever happens, I'll make sure we stop them." Her uncle smiled again, this time with a glint of approval in his eyes. "That's the spirit. But remember, Em, this isn't just about fighting. It's about outsmarting them. The real battle isn't always won with strength. It's won with strategy and patience." The words lingered in the air, and Emily felt their weight settle in her chest. Patience. She had always been more of an action-oriented person, someone who preferred to face challenges head-on. But now, she understood that the real test would be in how well she could wait, observe, and plan. This wasn't just about being brave, it was about being smart. As the night wore on and the stars began to twinkle above, Emily's thoughts drifted back to her father. He had been a man of action, but also of deep thought. She could still hear his voice, teaching her lessons about what it meant to be strong, not just in body, but in mind. And now, more than ever, she realized that she had inherited more than just his courage. She had inherited his wisdom, his ability to stay calm in the face of uncertainty. "All right, let's get some rest," Michael said, breaking her reverie. "Tomorrow, we get to work." Emily nodded, though her mind was far from restful. There was too much at stake now. They had already taken a huge step by confronting the bikers, but she knew that the real challenge lay ahead. Whoever was pulling the strings would not be easily defeated. They would come back, stronger and more prepared. And when they did, Emily would be ready. As they headed back inside, Emily glanced once more at the quiet street. The shadows that had once seemed peaceful now felt like they were watching her, waiting for the next move. She knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. But she also knew that with Michael by her side and her canines loyal and ready, she would never face it alone. The storm was far from over. But Emily was no longer just a little girl. She was a fighter. And this was only the beginning. The days following the confrontation with the bikers passed with a strange kind of calm, a false sense of peace that Emily couldn't shake off. The neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythms, morning joggers, kids playing in the streets, and the quiet hum of life. But underneath it all, Emily's sense of unease remained. She knew this wasn't the end, that the bikers were just pawns in a larger game, but her uncle had advised patience. She had to be smart, wait for the right moment, and keep her focus sharp. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and Michael stood on the front porch, watching the neighborhood around them. Rex and the other canines were lounging near the steps, their ever-watchful eyes scanning the street. The house felt more secure than it ever had before, thanks to Michael's careful preparations. But the feeling that something bigger was coming hung in the air like an unspoken promise. "You've been quiet these past few days," Michael said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "I can tell you're still processing everything. It's a lot, I know." Emily glanced at her uncle, his face reflecting the wisdom and experience of years spent in high-stakes situations. He was a rock, steady, unflinching, and yet she could see the subtle weariness in his eyes. He was thinking ahead, thinking about the real enemy. The bikers were just the surface. "I can't stop thinking about them," Emily replied, her voice steady but filled with concern. "The bikers might be locked up, but there's still someone else behind all of this. Someone who doesn't care about the law or any of us." Michael nodded slowly. "I know, kid. I feel the same. But we've got to take it slow. Rushing in without a plan is the quickest way to lose." Emily looked down at Rex, who was now lying at her feet, his eyes following her every movement. She bent down and ran her fingers through his thick coat, finding comfort in his presence. It was strange how much she relied on him now, not just for protection, but for reassurance. The dogs were more than her companions. They were her anchors in moments like these. "Have you heard anything from your sources?" Emily asked, glancing up at Michael. She knew her uncle had connections, people he trusted who had kept him informed about the bikers' movements and other shady activities in the area. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing concrete yet, but I've got a feeling. There's a bigger operation at play here. This isn't just about the bikers. It's bigger than that." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The sense of dread she had been carrying now seemed to have a solid shape, a real, tangible threat. She had always admired her uncle's ability to read people and situations, but for the first time, she wasn't sure she was ready for what he was hinting at. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "We keep our heads down, but we stay ready," Michael said, his tone resolute. "The key now is intelligence. We need to learn more about who's behind this, and we need to be prepared for when they make their next move. The first fight was just a warning shot." Emily nodded. "And what if they come for us again?" Michael's gaze turned sharp, his eyes narrowing with a focus that sent a chill down her spine. "Then we'll be ready. You've got the canines, and I've got my training. And if things go sideways, we'll fight smart. We're not going to let them get away with it." There was a certain finality in his voice that made Emily realize how serious the situation had become. They weren't just protecting their home anymore. They were standing in the path of something much larger and more dangerous. Later that evening, after dinner, Emily spent time with the dogs. walking them around the block as the last traces of daylight faded away. The air felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. The K9s stayed close to her, their bodies moving with a fluid grace that made her feel a little safer. She could hear them, their steady rhythmic breathing, their paws padding softly against the ground. They were always vigilant, always watching, always ready to act when called upon. As they passed the park, Emily noticed a few shadows in the distance, figures moving near the edge of the woods. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but as she squinted into the dim light, she saw them more clearly. It was a group of people. She couldn't make out their faces, but their body language was unmistakable. They were watching her. She froze. Rex, sensing her tension, growled softly, his body stiffening. The other dogs gathered around her, their heads raised, alert. Emily felt a rush of adrenaline as the figures in the distance seemed to grow closer. Her breath quickened. She knew better than to make assumptions, but this felt different. They weren't just pedestrians or people walking their dogs. These figures were too purposeful, too silent. One of the figures stepped forward, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. The silhouette was familiar, too familiar. It was one of the bikers from the group they had confronted. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were several others with him. "Uncle Mike," Emily whispered under her breath, her mind racing. The bikers were out again. But this time, they weren't making noise. They were lurking, watching, waiting for the right moment. Emily took a deep breath, her hands steady as she held the leashes of the dogs. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. She had no idea what they were planning, but it didn't matter. She was ready. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her again. She quickly turned and headed back toward the house, keeping her eyes on the figures in the distance. The K9s stayed by her side, their posture tense. She could feel their readiness, the unspoken connection between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. As they neared the house, she saw Michael standing at the door, his stance relaxed, but his eyes scanning the street, just like he always did. He must have noticed the change in the air, too. "Inside. Now," Michael said, his voice low but urgent. He had sensed the danger as well. Emily and the dogs quickly made their way inside, locking the door behind them. She felt a chill run through her as she realized that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The bikers had returned, and they weren't here just to cause trouble. They were here to send a message. And this time, Emily wasn't sure that her dogs and her uncle's skills would be enough to protect them. The quiet that had settled over the neighborhood after the bikers' first defeat didn't last long. As much as Emily wanted to believe it was over, her instincts were still on edge. The shadows that had gathered near the park the night before were a clear sign that the bikers were circling back, and this time, they weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking to send a message. Inside the house, Emily sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a notebook her uncle had given her. The pages were filled with notes, scribbled observations, and diagrams. It was her uncle's way of helping her organize her thoughts, break down the situation, and think strategically. Michael had always been methodical, patient, and never one to rush into a situation without first gathering as much information as possible. And now, with the return of the bikers, he was putting his plan into motion. Emily's fingers hovered over a page of names and numbers, written in a neat, organized manner. They weren't just notes about the bikers. They were leads, connections, people who might know something more about who was behind the gang, who was pulling the strings. Michael had a network, people who had worked with him in the past, people who had access to information that wasn't readily available. But so far, no one had been able to provide anything concrete. Her uncle entered the kitchen, his expression thoughtful, his eyes scanning the room as if he were already preparing for the next move. He was always one step ahead, but this time, Emily could see the uncertainty in his gaze. He knew the bikers were only a small part of the puzzle, and the bigger threat was still out there, waiting, watching. "Anything?" Michael asked as he pulled up a chair and sat across from her. His voice was calm, but there was a subtle tension in his posture. Emily shook her head. "Nothing that leads anywhere specific. Just the usual stuff, random names, and some vague references to an underground network in the city. But no one's given us a solid lead on the real boss behind the bikers. Michael leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. We're getting closer, though. I can feel it. Emily closed the notebook and pushed it aside. What's our next move, then? Michael sat forward, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. We need to get to the bottom of this, Em. The bikers are just a distraction. Someone's using them to intimidate the people around here, and we need to find out who. I have a few more people to talk to, and I think we're going to get a lead soon. Emily felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten. She knew her uncle was right. The bikers weren't the real threat. They were a tool, a means to an end. But who was behind it all? Who had enough power to control a group of ruthless bikers and use them as pawns? Before Emily could voice her concerns, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside. It wasn't the usual hum of traffic, nor the faint sound of a neighbor returning home. This was deliberate, slow, and heavy. It was the unmistakable roar of a motorcycle. Emily and Michael exchanged a glance. They didn't need to say anything. Both knew that whoever was on that bike wasn't just passing through. It was another test, another message. Rex, Bella, Max, and Luna sprang to attention, their ears twitching at the sound. They had been trained to respond to threats, and even from inside the house they could sense the change in the air. Emily stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. Uncle Mike, it's them, isn't it? Michael didn't answer right away. He moved toward the door, his movements precise, measured. He wasn't just preparing for another confrontation. He was preparing to face the truth. This wasn't about chasing down bikers. This was about finding the person behind them, the one who was orchestrating everything. Stay inside, Em, Michael said, his voice firm but not unkind. Let me handle this. You and the dog stay here. But Emily wasn't about to sit idly by while the threat loomed so close. She knew the game was changing. It wasn't just about defending their home anymore. It was about uncovering the enemy, and the only way to do that was to face them head on. I'm going with you, she said, her voice steady. Michael turned, his expression hardening slightly. It's too dangerous, Em. You know that. I can't let you get involved in this. I'm not a little girl anymore, Uncle Mike. I can handle myself, and I won't sit here while you're out there trying to do this alone. There was a brief moment of silence as Michael regarded her. He had always tried to protect her, shield her from the darker side of the world, but he also knew that Emily was no stranger to danger. She had proven that in the past. And though he would never admit it, part of him knew she was right. She was ready. With a sigh, Michael nodded. All right, but you stay close, and you listen to me. Understood? Emily gave him a sharp nod, and together they stepped outside. The motorcycle was parked a few houses down, the rider sitting still, facing their home. The figure was cloaked in the usual leather jacket, the helmet obscuring their face. But Emily could tell that this wasn't just another random biker. This was someone who knew exactly where they were, someone who wanted them to see them. Michael signaled for Emily to stay behind him as they approached, keeping his movements calm and purposeful. The canines remained alert, their bodies poised and ready. When they were close enough, the rider removed their helmet. It was a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He looked at Emily and Michael without any hint of fear or hesitation. Thought you'd be the one to show up, the man said, his voice low and gruff. Michael stepped forward, his jaw clenched. Who are you? What do you want? The man smirked, clearly enjoying the tension in the air. You're not dealing with some small-time thugs anymore, Navy SEAL. You've gotten too close. And now, you're part of the problem. Emily felt a chill run through her. This was no ordinary biker. This was someone who had real power, someone who had been watching them, studying them. The game had just changed. Michael didn't back down, his voice steady and unwavering. I'm not afraid of you, and I will find out who's behind all of this. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of quiet menace. We'll see about that. You'll regret digging any deeper. Without another word, the man turned and walked back to his bike. revving the engine. As he sped off, Emily's mind raced. This wasn't just a warning, this was a declaration. "Uncle Mike," Emily said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to find out who he is. Fast." Michael's face hardened. "I'm on it. We're getting close, Em. I can feel it. But now, we've got to move faster." As the motorcycle's roar faded into the distance, Emily stood still, her heart racing. The pieces were falling into place, and she knew that everything was about to change. The enemy had shown their face. Now it was time to find out who they really were. The air was thick with tension as Michael and Emily stood in the driveway, watching the motorcycle's fading taillights disappear into the night. The man who had confronted them was no ordinary biker. His words hung in the air, ominous and full of promise. "You'll regret digging any deeper." It was a threat, plain and simple. And it made one thing clear. They weren't just dealing with a gang anymore. They were dealing with someone who had the power to crush them if they pushed too hard. But Michael's expression remained unchanged, a stone-cold mask of determination. He wasn't about to let fear control their next move. He had been in far more dangerous situations than this. He had faced death and come out victorious. But this felt different. Whoever was behind the bikers wasn't just dangerous. They were smart, calculating, and most of all, patient. "We need to get ahead of this," Michael said, his voice low and commanding. "We can't wait around for them to make the next move. We've got to force their hand." Emily felt a chill run through her, but she understood exactly what her uncle was saying. The man on the bike had just given them a dangerous clue. This wasn't just about protecting their home anymore. It was about finding the enemy, unmasking them, and taking them down before they could strike again. "What's the plan?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the rising anxiety in her chest. Michael glanced over at her, his sharp blue eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and something else. A quiet pride, maybe. "We're going to hit them where it hurts. We need to gather more information. We're going to find out who that man is, and we're going to make him talk." Emily nodded. She had been learning over the past few weeks how to think like her uncle, how to look beyond the obvious, how to anticipate the next move, and how to outsmart an enemy who was always 2 steps ahead. "You're right," she said. "We need to act quickly. But where do we start?" Michael exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the street. The neighborhood had once felt like a sanctuary, a place of safety. Now it felt more like a battlefield, and they were on the front lines. "There's a place," Michael said, finally breaking the silence. "A warehouse on the outskirts of town. I've heard rumors about it for a while. It's connected to the bikers. I'm willing to bet that's where they're hiding the real power behind all of this." Emily felt a flicker of doubt. "How do you know that?" Michael's gaze was steely. "I don't know for sure, but I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts. And right now, everything points there." Without another word, Michael began to move toward the truck. Emily followed close behind, her heart beating faster as she realized that they were about to dive headfirst into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The drive was long and quiet, the streets passing in a blur as the truck rumbled along the dark highway. Emily sat beside her uncle, her mind racing. She had always known her life wasn't going to be simple, not after her father's death. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She wasn't just dealing with petty criminals anymore. She was going up against something far more organized, far more ruthless. As the truck neared the outskirts of town, the buildings grew fewer, and the landscape became more industrial. The warehouses loomed ahead like ghosts in the night, their darkened windows hiding whatever secrets lay inside. Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just a trip to gather information. It was the beginning of a dangerous game, one where they were the ones being hunted. When they finally arrived at the warehouse, Michael parked the truck a safe distance away. He turned to Emily, his expression serious. "We're not going in blind. This place is likely crawling with people. I want you to stay close to me and keep the dogs on a tight leash. No heroics. Understood?" Emily nodded, her nerves firing as she looked over at Rex and the others, who were now standing alert in the back of the truck. They had trained for moments like this, moments where every movement counted, and every decision could be the difference between life and death. but she wasn't sure if any amount of training could prepare them for what was inside that warehouse. Michael gave her one last look, checking the gear he had prepared. He had brought night vision goggles, a few radios for communication, and a handful of tools that might come in handy. He was a man who didn't take chances, and Emily respected that. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath them. The canines, as always, were by their side, their senses heightened. Rex led the way, his keen nose sniffing the air for any sign of trouble. The other dogs stayed close, ready for anything. As they approached the warehouse, Michael signaled for them to stop. He raised his hand, gesturing for silence. The wind carried only the faintest sounds of movement from within the building, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand up. Michael pointed toward a small side door at the back of the warehouse. "That's our entry point," he whispered. "We move quickly and we stick to the shadows. No noise, no lights." Emily's heart pounded as they moved forward, her hand gripping Rex's leash tightly. The canines stayed low, their bodies silent and agile as they followed their lead. They were almost at the door when Emily's foot accidentally brushed against a loose metal piece on the ground, sending a faint clang through the night. They froze. The seconds felt like hours as Emily's eyes met her uncle's. Michael's expression was unreadable, his gaze scanning the area around them. He motioned for them to stay put, then slowly and silently moved to the door, testing the handle. It was locked. Emily's breath caught in her throat, but Michael didn't seem fazed. He pulled a small tool from his belt and went to work on the lock, his movements precise and practiced. It didn't take long before the door clicked open. They entered the warehouse, the air inside thick and stale, and the darkness so complete it swallowed them whole. Emily's eyes strained to adjust, but her heart was racing. They were in, and the real danger was only just beginning. As they moved deeper into the shadows, the sounds of muffled voices reached Emily's ears. The warehouse wasn't empty. Someone was inside. Michael raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. Emily stood perfectly still, her breath shallow. This was it. They had made it inside, but now they had to figure out who was in charge. Who was pulling the strings? And most importantly, how were they going to get out of here without drawing attention? Suddenly, a door on the far side of the warehouse opened, and several figures stepped into view, their faces hidden in the shadows. Emily's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. They were here to confront someone. And Emily was ready to find out who it was. The warehouse was a maze of steel beams and rusted machinery, and as Emily and Michael moved deeper into its shadows, she couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of the place. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of distant machinery echoed throughout the cavernous space. It was clear that this place had been abandoned for years, yet tonight, it was alive with hidden activity. They moved silently, their every step calculated and purposeful. The dogs were in their element, tracking, observing, alert. Rex led the way, his nose sniffing the air and his ears flicking at every sound. Max, Bella, and Luna followed closely, their bodies low to the ground, their movements nearly imperceptible. Michael stayed a few paces ahead, his eyes scanning the environment with military precision. Emily had seen this side of him before, when he was in his element, when danger was imminent. But even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. They were about to uncover something far bigger than just a few rogue bikers. They reached a set of large metal doors, partially open, with the faintest glow of light leaking from the cracks. The voices they had heard earlier were now clearer, louder. The low murmur of conversation bounced off the walls, but it wasn't just idle chatter. There was something deliberate in the tone, something that suggested power and authority. Michael held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He motioned for Emily to stay close, then crouched down beside the door. Through the narrow crack, Emily could make out the shadowy figures inside. The sound of their voices grew louder as she focused, and then she heard it. "Where is he?" one voice growled. "We can't afford any more delays. He promised us support, and we're getting nothing. It's time we moved on without him." Emily's heart raced as she exchanged a glance with Michael. The tension in the room was palpable. This was bigger than she had thought. This wasn't just a gang of bikers looking to cause trouble. There were higher powers involved. "Patience," another voice responded, calm and collected. "The time will come, but we need to keep moving forward. The operation is in motion. We've been waiting too long. We need to make sure we have the right leverage." Emily's thoughts raced. Leverage. That word echoed in her mind. What were they talking about? Who was the he they were waiting for? And what was this operation they were planning? Michael gave her a quick, silent nod, signaling for her to stay put. He slipped his hand into his jacket and pulled out a small pair of night vision goggles. Emily had seen him use them before, whenever he needed to gather information without being seen. He handed her a set, and she put them on quickly, adjusting the straps as she peered through the lenses. The room inside was dimly lit by a few overhead lights, casting long shadows that made it hard to make out the details. But through the goggles, she could see more clearly now. There were 5 men in the room, all wearing black leather jackets and looking far more organized than the random bikers she had encountered before. They were sitting around a table, covered with blueprints, maps, and other documents. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep scar running across his cheek, stood up and slammed his fist onto the table. "I don't care who's in charge. If we don't get the resources we need, I'll take this operation elsewhere," the man growled. "I don't need any more delays." Emily's stomach twisted. She had seen this kind of aggression before. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was a power player. Someone who had the strength and the connections to control everything around him. Michael leaned closer to Emily. His voice was barely a whisper. "We need to know who this is. He's the key to everything." Before Emily could respond, the sound of a door opening behind them froze them both in place. A low, heavy footstep echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she silently motioned for the dogs to stay quiet. They obeyed without hesitation. The figure in the doorway was a silhouette against the faint light behind him. The shape was familiar. Too familiar. Emily's breath caught as she realized who it was. It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned them to back off, the man who had threatened them. But this time, there was no helmet. This time, the face was revealed. It was Marcus Blackwell. Emily's mind raced. Marcus Blackwell. The name hit her like a freight train. She had heard of him before. He was a notorious figure in the underground world. He had connections in every dark corner of the city, and his influence stretched far beyond the bikers. He wasn't just a leader of a gang. He was a criminal mastermind, a man who could control everything from drug trafficking to arms deals, and even political corruption. He had been operating under the radar for years, but now Emily understood the full scope of the threat. The bikers weren't his only pawns. He had an empire built on fear and manipulation, and he was using the bikers as a means to expand his power. The men around the table stood up as Blackwell entered, their demeanor shifting immediately. There was no mistaking the respect they had for him. "Did you bring it?" Blackwell's voice was smooth, but there was a cold edge to it that made Emily shiver. One of the men, a younger-looking associate, nodded and handed him a thick folder. Blackwell took it without a word and began flipping through the papers, his eyes scanning each page quickly. Emily couldn't make out the details, but the serious nature of the documents was clear. "We need this to work," Blackwell said, his voice low and dangerous. "If we can pull this off, we'll have control of the entire city. Everything, the drugs, the money, the people, will be ours, and no one can stop us." Emily's mind was spinning. The city? Was this what they were planning? A takeover? She had to know more. She had to find out what Blackwell was planning and put an end to it before it went any further. Michael's hand gripped her shoulder gently, signaling for her to pull back. They had the information they needed. They had a name, and they had a glimpse into Blackwell's operation. But now, they had to act quickly. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. As they made their way quietly back to the truck, Emily's thoughts were racing. They had uncovered the truth, but it wasn't just about the bikers anymore. It was about stopping Blackwell and his empire before it consumed everything. The cool night air seemed to hang heavier as Michael and Emily walked back to the truck, their hearts still racing from the revelation they had just uncovered. Marcus Blackwell wasn't just a local thug. He was the orchestrator of an elaborate underground empire that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the city. The bikers were only one piece of his puzzle, a puzzle that was now beginning to take shape in Emily's mind. The weight of the information was almost suffocating. Blackwell wasn't just running petty operations, he had plans for something far more dangerous. Control. The kind of control that could reshape the entire city. And they were standing in the middle of it, holding the thread that could unravel everything. Michael's face remained unreadable as they approached the truck, but Emily could sense the tension in his shoulders. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. As they climbed into the truck, Michael started the engine with a low growl, the sound filling the air. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows on the empty road ahead. Emily's mind was still spinning. What Blackwell had said in that warehouse kept replaying in her head. If we can pull this off, we'll have control of the entire city. Everything, the drugs, the money, the people, will be ours. And no one can stop us. How long had Blackwell been planning this? How many lives were already at risk? The truth was, Emily didn't know the full extent of his reach, but she knew one thing for certain. They couldn't sit back and wait for him to make his move. They had to act, and they had to act fast. "Uncle Mike," Emily said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of urgency. "We need to go to the authorities. We have the evidence now. We can take him down." Michael's eyes flicked to her, his face hardening slightly. "We don't know enough yet. Not nearly enough." He paused, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "And we can't trust the authorities with this just yet. Blackwell has too many connections, people in high places. We need to gather more intel. We need to know exactly what we're up against before we make our next move." Emily nodded, though her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She understood Michael's caution, but it was hard to shake the feeling that every second they waited, the more lives Blackwell would destroy. The people he was manipulating, those innocent people who had no idea what kind of monster they were dealing with, were being caught in the web he had spun. "Then what do we do now?" she asked, her voice quieter this time. Michael's jaw clenched as he drove, his mind clearly racing through the options. Finally he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "We need to dig deeper. We need to find his weak spots, his vulnerabilities. He's too powerful right now, and if we're going to take him down, we need leverage. We need to know everything about his operation." Emily turned her gaze toward the window, watching the streetlights blur past. "What if we don't have time?" she whispered more to herself than to Michael. "What if we can't wait? What if Blackwell already has everything in motion?" Michael didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. They both knew that time was quickly running out. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Michael worked tirelessly, reaching out to old contacts, people who owed him favors, people who still operated in the shadows of the city. Emily and the dog stayed on high alert, the sense of impending danger never far from her thoughts. Each day, the walls seemed to close in around them, and each passing moment felt like a countdown to the moment when Blackwell would finally make his move. The weight of the information they had collected about Blackwell's plans, his connections, his empire, felt like a ticking time bomb. Emily could feel the pressure building. There was only so much they could do with the knowledge they had. They had to act soon. Then, one evening, as Emily was sitting with the dogs in the living room, Michael burst through the door, his face grim. "It's happening," he said, his voice low. "I've got confirmation. Blackwell's making his move tonight. He's going after the mayor." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The mayor? Blackwell was going after someone with real political power. It was clear that Blackwell's ambitions stretched far beyond the criminal world. He was reaching for the heart of the city. "How do you know?" Emily asked, standing up quickly, her eyes narrowing. "One of my contacts, someone inside his network, gave me the heads up. Blackwell has been planning a public deal. He's using the mayor to solidify his control over the city. He's making it look like the mayor is working with him, but the truth is, he's going to make it look like the mayor is under his thumb. Once that happens, Blackwell will have the power to manipulate everything. He'll have control over the entire city council, over law enforcement, over everything." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. "We can't let him do that. We need to stop him. Now." Michael nodded, his face hardening. "We're going to. But we need to be smart about this. We don't have much time. He's already made his move, and he'll be surrounded by people who are loyal to him. We can't just walk in there and start a fight. We need leverage, and we need to take Blackwell out before he can fully execute his plan. How do we get to him? Emily asked, her voice steady with resolve. Michael turned to face her, his eyes intense. We go straight to the source. We'll use the mayor as bait. Blackwell won't be able to resist making his move tonight, and when he does, we'll be ready. We're going to gather the final pieces of the puzzle, expose his operation, and take him down once and for all. Emily's mind raced as she processed the plan. It was dangerous. There was no denying that. But it was their best shot at stopping Blackwell before he could gain the kind of power that would destroy everything. Let's do it, Emily said, her voice resolute. Let's end this. That night, Michael and Emily, with the help of their trusted K9s, infiltrated the location where Blackwell's deal was taking place. They had managed to gather enough information to pinpoint the meeting spot, an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city, far from the public eye but within reach of Blackwell's network. The stakes had never been higher. As they approached the complex, the weight of what was at stake pressed down on them. This was the final showdown, the moment that would determine the future of the city. It wasn't just about stopping Blackwell's plans anymore. It was about taking down the criminal empire that had threatened everything Emily cared about. The web had tightened around them, but now they were ready to cut the thread. The night air felt different, heavier somehow, as Emily and Michael moved through the shadows toward the abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. The buildings loomed ahead, dark and imposing, casting long, twisted shadows on the cracked pavement. The complex was eerily silent, save for the faint sounds of distant cars and the occasional chirp of crickets. Emily's breath was steady, but her pulse quickened with each step. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would use the mayor's public meeting with Blackwell as bait. The hope was that Blackwell would reveal himself, forcing him to make a move that would expose his operation. But as simple as the plan was, the risks were high. They were walking into the heart of Blackwell's empire, where the odds of success seemed slim. Emily's mind was focused, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. They were on the cusp of something big. Tonight would decide whether Blackwell's empire crumbled or whether it would grow stronger. She glanced at her uncle, who had been her protector and guide throughout this entire journey. His expression was calm, his movements deliberate, just like always, but Emily could see the tension in his eyes. This was the moment he had been preparing for. They reached the perimeter of the complex, and Michael held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He crouched down, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "The mayor should be arriving soon," Michael said, his voice a whisper. "We'll wait for him to enter, and then we move in. Stay sharp and stay close. Blackwell's men will be everywhere." Emily nodded, her hand tightening around Rex's leash. The K9s were already alert, sensing the change in the air. Rex, as always, was the leader, his gaze never wavering from the shadows ahead. The other dogs flanked Emily, their movements synchronized, ready for whatever came next. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretched thin with anticipation. Emily's mind raced, replaying the events that had brought them here, the discovery of Blackwell's operation, the careful planning, the long nights of waiting for the right moment. But now, the time had come. She wasn't just standing on the sidelines anymore. She was part of this. She had proven that she could hold her own. And tonight, they would finish what they started. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance, breaking the darkness. A black SUV rolled down the cracked road, slowing as it approached the entrance of the complex. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was the mayor, just as Michael had predicted. "Stay ready," Michael whispered. As the mayor's car came to a stop, Emily's muscles tensed. The door opened, and the mayor stepped out, flanked by a few of his security detail. His face was drawn, his movements cautious. He was clearly nervous, but he wasn't alone. Two of Blackwell's men emerged from the shadows, their hands resting on the handles of concealed weapons. "Let's move," Michael muttered, and they all silently crept forward, staying close to the walls, slipping between the shadows. They reached the building's back entrance, where they found a small access door, partially open. Michael pushed it open gently, and they slipped inside, careful not to make a sound. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, the floors covered in dust and debris. Emily's eyes darted around, her senses on high alert. They were in, but now the real danger began. They crept through the warehouse, moving from shadow to shadow. Emily's heart raced with each footstep, the quiet hum of the building's machinery echoing in her ears. They could hear voices up ahead, louder now, more distinct. Blackwell's men were gathering. The deal was about to take place. Emily's hand gripped Rex's leash tightly, her mind focused on the mission ahead. This was it, the moment of truth. They reached a large open room at the heart of the warehouse, where a group of men were gathered around a table, papers and documents scattered before them. Blackwell stood at the head of the table, his back turned to them, talking to the mayor. He was taller than Emily had imagined, his presence commanding, his face cold and calculating. He had a quiet power about him, an almost sinister confidence that radiated from his every word. The mayor stood across from him, looking uneasy, glancing nervously at Blackwell's men. His bodyguard was close by, hands on his weapons, ready for anything. The air was thick with tension. Emily could feel it, the sense of impending danger, the knowledge that this was the moment when everything would either fall into place or collapse. "Gentlemen," Blackwell said, his voice smooth and controlled, "this is a new chapter for this city. With the right resources, we'll have control of everything, the economy, the police force, the power in this city. We'll make this place work for us, and the mayor here is going to make sure that happens." The mayor shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "I agreed to this, but I want assurances, Blackwell. I want to be sure you'll keep your promises." Blackwell turned toward him, a sly smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Don't worry, Mayor. You'll get everything you want. All I ask is for your full cooperation. After that, we both get what we want." Emily's eyes narrowed. This was it. The deal. The moment when Blackwell would make his move, and the mayor would become a pawn in his game. But she knew they couldn't let it happen. Not now. Michael signaled to her, and they moved forward, just as Blackwell's men began to turn toward them, sensing something was off. The time for stealth was over. "Not so fast, Blackwell!" Michael's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. Blackwell's men immediately drew their weapons, but they were too late. Rex, Bella, Max, and Luna sprang into action, moving with precision and speed. The dogs tackled two of Blackwell's men to the ground before they could fire a shot. Emily didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, grabbing a nearby chair and throwing it toward one of the remaining gunmen, knocking the weapon from his hands. "Get down!" Michael shouted, pulling the mayor to the ground as gunfire erupted around them. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of gunshots and shouts echoing through the warehouse. Michael, ever the professional, moved with deadly efficiency. He took out one of Blackwell's men with a swift move, disarming him before he could get a shot off. Emily and the dogs worked together, taking down the remaining gunmen, using their speed and agility to outmaneuver them. It was over in moments. Blackwell's men were disarmed and on the ground, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But Blackwell, ever the strategist, was not so easily caught. He had backed into a corner, his eyes wild with anger. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" he growled. Michael stepped forward, his gun trained on Blackwell. "You're done, Blackwell. The game's over." For a moment, there was silence. Blackwell's eyes flicked around the room, calculating, looking for an escape. But it was clear now. He had nowhere to run. "I think you've underestimated me," Blackwell sneered, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew the end was near. The mayor stood shakily, looking between Michael and Blackwell. I didn't know it was like this. I didn't realize the depth of your operation." "You were just a pawn," Michael said, his voice cold. "And now we've taken your king." The canines growled in unison, keeping the remaining men at bay. It was over. Blackwell's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing left for him but the consequences of his actions. As the police arrived and took Blackwell and his men into custody, Emily stood next to Michael, her heart still pounding. They had done it. They had stopped the man who had threatened their city. and the mayor would have a chance to make things right. It had been dangerous, but they had come through. For Emily, this was more than just a victory. It was the moment she had proven to herself that she was capable of anything, that she could stand shoulder to shoulder with those who fought for what was right. And together, with Michael and the K9s, they had taken down the most dangerous man the city had ever known. As the police led Blackwell away, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. It was over. The city was safe. But as she looked at Michael, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something bigger, something that would continue to shape her future. The dust had barely settled. The warehouse was littered with the aftermath of the battle: broken glass, discarded weapons, and the remnants of a plan that had been swiftly dismantled. The sound of sirens filled the night air as police vehicles flooded the area, their lights flashing in a chaotic, almost surreal rhythm. Emily stood at the edge of the room, her heart still pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, steadying herself. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving a quiet exhaustion in its wake. The danger had passed. Blackwell was in custody, his empire crumbling, and the mayor was safe. But even now, the magnitude of what they had just faced felt overwhelming. Michael stood beside her, his gaze hard and focused. His face, usually calm and controlled, showed the first signs of wear. The toll of the night, the weight of the decisions, had left their mark. But there was no room for rest yet, not now. Emily glanced over at the K9s, Rex, Bella, Max, and Luna, all standing at attention, their bodies relaxed but alert, as if they too understood the gravity of the moment. The dogs had been crucial in the fight, their swift, coordinated movements making all the difference in the chaos. Emily felt a surge of gratitude for them, her partners in this fight, her family. The police moved through the warehouse, securing the area and rounding up Blackwell's men. A few of them had managed to escape, but the majority were detained, their futures uncertain. The operation had been quick and decisive, thanks to Michael's careful planning and the unwavering support of the K9s. As the police led Blackwell away in cuffs, Michael turned to Emily, his face softened by the rarest of expressions: pride. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. "Better than good." Emily's lips curled into a tired but genuine smile. "We did it, Uncle Mike. We really did it." Michael nodded, his gaze drifting toward the commotion outside. "Yeah, but it's not over yet." Emily frowned, sensing the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" "Blackwell's just the tip of the iceberg. His operation was big, but it's not the only one. There are others out there waiting for their chance." He paused, his voice lowering. "The city won't be safe until we clean out every corner. And that means we keep moving forward." Emily understood. She had seen it in his eyes, the drive to protect, to fight for what was right, to never stop until the job was done. And she realized that this victory, though hard-won, was only the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of Blackwell's arrest spread like wildfire, and the mayor, though shaken, began working to restore order to the city. The media hailed the operation as a success, praising the bravery of the officers and the mysterious hero who had helped bring Blackwell to justice. Of course, no one knew the full story, not about Michael, not about the K9s, and certainly not about the personal stakes involved. For Emily, it was a strange feeling. She had been part of something bigger than herself, something that changed the course of the city's future. But the recognition felt distant, almost surreal. She hadn't done it for the accolades. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because Blackwell and his men had threatened everything she cared about. But there was something more. It was the realization that despite the chaos, she had never felt more certain of who she was and what she was capable of. She wasn't just a little girl anymore. She was a fighter, a protector, just like her uncle, and she would continue to fight for as long as it took. A week later, Emily found herself standing on the porch of her home, looking out over the neighborhood. The streets were peaceful again, the kind of calm that had been missing for so long. It felt strange, almost like they had won back something that had been taken from them. A sense of safety, a sense of control. Her uncle joined her, leaning against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the street. The two of them stood there for a long time, neither of them speaking. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a brief respite before the next storm. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "So what now?" Emily didn't hesitate. "We keep going." Michael raised an eyebrow. "I knew you were going to say that." She smiled. "The work's not done. There's still more to do. There are always more fights. But I'll be ready." Michael chuckled softly. "I have no doubt." They stood there, side by side, looking out over the neighborhood. The canines were resting at their feet, their heads lowered in contentment, the day's work done. For now, at least. And as Emily watched the horizon, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready. She had learned from the best. She had fought beside the bravest. And no matter what challenge lay ahead, she would face it with the same resolve, the same courage that had brought her this far. They had won this fight, but the war against the darkness that lingered in the shadows of the city was far from over. Emily was no longer just a witness to the battle. She was a part of it. And together, with Michael and the canines by her side, she would continue to fight for justice, for safety, and for the future. The city was quieter now. The news of Marcus Blackwell's arrest had sent ripples through the underground world, and with his fall, the criminal networks that had flourished in the shadows began to crumble. But peace, Emily had learned, was never as simple as it seemed. The cracks were still there, still waiting to be filled by those who sought power. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot. Emily sat in her room that evening, the weight of the past few weeks settling on her shoulders. The rush of adrenaline, the danger, the fear, now it all seemed distant. But she knew better than to think the worst was behind her. There were still loose ends. Blackwell's men were in custody, but there were still pockets of his operation out there, hidden, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But tonight was different. For the first time in weeks, she had a moment to herself. The house was quiet. Michael was out meeting with contacts, the canines were resting in the backyard, and the world outside was still. In the silence, Emily reflected on how much she had changed. She had faced danger, fought beside her uncle and the canines, and taken down one of the city's most dangerous men. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the park months ago, unsure of what to do when the bikers first showed up. Now, she understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself, and what it meant to never back down. The sound of a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Michael standing in the doorway, his face softening when he saw her. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, a hint of pride in his tone. "You all right?" Emily smiled, grateful for his presence. "Yeah, just thinking." He stepped into the room, leaning against the doorframe. "It's been a long road, hasn't it?" "Feels like a lifetime," she said, crossing her arms. "But it's not over, is it?" Michael shook his head, his eyes hardening slightly. "No, it's not. Blackwell's arrest was a big blow, but there are still others. People like him don't just disappear. They're replaced. But we've made progress, and you've helped make that happen." Emily's heart swelled with pride, but a part of her still felt unsettled. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were still too many unanswered questions. The city might have been safer, but there were more threats lurking in the shadows, ready to take Blackwell's place. She had seen how power worked, the corrupting influence, the way it could slip through the cracks and reassemble itself. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Michael sighed, pushing himself off the doorframe. "We continue cleaning up. There are more men we need to track down, more connections to sever. But the bigger picture is this. We have to make sure the city stays safe, and that means we can't stop moving forward. We'll need to work with the authorities, keep the pressure on, and make sure the void Blackwell left is filled with something better." Emily nodded, her mind racing. She had seen firsthand how a few powerful people could control everything. But now, she understood how to fight back. She knew that there was more to it than just taking down one bad guy. It was about creating change, making sure the right people were in power, and ensuring that the city's future was in safe hands. "We'll need to keep an eye on things," Emily said thoughtfully. "The bikers might be gone, but there's always someone else out there who wants to fill that space." "Exactly," Michael replied, his expression grave. That's why we need to stay vigilant. You and I, we've got a lot of work to do." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening. "But I'm proud of you, Em. You've grown into someone I can trust, someone who will always stand up for what's right. I couldn't have done this without you." Emily smiled, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had always admired her uncle, but now she realized just how much she had learned from him, how much she had grown. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the park that day. She was stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever. "We'll do it together," she said, looking up at him, her voice firm. Michael gave her a nod, his eyes reflecting the same unspoken promise. Together. The next morning, Emily woke early, her mind still buzzing from the conversation with Michael. She had a sense of clarity now, a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt before. The city might have been quiet for now, but she knew that the work was far from done. Blackwell's arrest was only the beginning. They had to keep moving forward, keep fighting for a better future. She stepped into the backyard, where the canines were already awake, waiting for her. Rex wagged his tail when he saw her, and Emily knelt down to pet him, feeling the familiar warmth of their bond. Bella, Max, and Luna trotted over, their energy palpable. These dogs had been by her side through everything, through every challenge, every battle. They were more than just animals. They were family. "Ready for another day?" Emily asked them, her voice filled with determination. The dogs responded with eager barks, and Emily smiled, feeling the weight of the world shift ever so slightly. With the canines by her side, and with Michael's guidance, she knew that they could face whatever came next. A few days later, Emily and Michael stood in the heart of the city, overlooking the skyline. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the streets below. It was a beautiful sight, one that made Emily feel hopeful for the first time in a long while. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Michael said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "We have, and we're just getting started." They stood there in silence for a moment, both of them watching as the city below continued on with its rhythm. But Emily knew that things would never be the same, not after everything they had been through. The future was still uncertain, but she was ready for it, ready to fight for what mattered, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because together, with Michael, the canines, and the people they cared about, they could take on anything. And no matter how dark the world might get, Emily would never stop fighting for the light. A month had passed since the fall of Marcus Blackwell. The city had settled into a kind of uneasy peace, the kind that followed a storm, calm, but with the lingering sense that something else was waiting just beneath the surface. Emily had done her part to help clean up the wreckage of Blackwell's empire, but despite the victories, there was an undeniable sense that the job was far from complete. She knew that Blackwell hadn't been the only one pulling strings in the shadows. As the days went by, Emily and Michael worked relentlessly, following leads, making connections, and tracking down the remnants of Blackwell's network. But every time they thought they had cornered one piece of the puzzle, another part seemed to slip further out of reach. It was as if Blackwell had designed his empire to scatter, with each operation linked to a bigger, more dangerous force. It was early morning when Emily found herself sitting at the kitchen table, looking over her notes from the past few weeks. The canines were in the backyard, their bodies stretched out in the warmth of the sun, but their eyes always alert. Rex was beside her, his head resting on her lap as she ran her fingers through his fur. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was brewing, that they were just one step behind a threat they couldn't yet see. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Michael's voice from the doorway. "We need to talk." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had gotten used to these kinds of conversations, ones where Michael had uncovered something troubling. He walked in and set a manila folder down on the table, the weight of it heavy in the air. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet, her eyes scanning his expression. She could tell from his posture that this wasn't just another lead. This was something bigger. Michael sat down across from her, his face serious. "I've been hearing whispers, the kind that go beyond Blackwell. The people who helped him, the ones he kept hidden in plain sight. They've gone underground, but they're not gone. They've regrouped. And there's something else. There's someone else. Someone we haven't accounted for. Emily frowned, her pulse quickening. Who? Who's left? Michael slid the folder toward her, and she opened it to find a series of photos and documents. The first photo was of a man, dark hair, sharp features, and cold eyes. His name was circled in red ink. David Kane, Michael said, his voice low. He's the one who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Blackwell's right-hand man. Emily's brow furrowed. I've never heard of him. No one has. That's the problem. Kane's good at staying in the shadows, using his connections to get what he wants without ever revealing his hand. He's the one who provided Blackwell with most of his resources, his logistics, and now he's disappeared. Emily studied the photos closely. So, what happens now? Now we track him down, Michael said, standing up and pacing the room. Blackwell was just a pawn, and we only caught him because he got too reckless. Kane is a different kind of threat. He's more calculated, more dangerous. Emily felt a wave of determination rush over her. Where do we start? Michael stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes steady. We start with his connections. Kane's network is vast. He's linked to powerful people in the city, people who have no idea what they're really involved in. I've already made some calls and I've got a few leads, but it's going to take time, and it's going to get dangerous. Emily stood up, a fire igniting in her chest. We don't have time. If Kane is as dangerous as you say, we can't wait for him to make the first move. Michael studied her for a long moment, his expression softening with pride. I know, and that's why I'm not doing this alone this time. You're with me, Em. We've got to do this right. The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and late nights. Emily pored over every piece of intel they could find, trying to trace Kane's movements. She'd gotten used to the idea of fighting in the shadows, but this felt different. It wasn't just about stopping one person anymore. It was about dismantling a network, a web of corruption that spread deep into the city's foundations. One lead took them to an old storage facility on the outskirts of town. The place was run down, barely standing, with rusted locks on the doors and a few flickering lights that didn't seem to work. But it was the perfect cover for someone like Kane, someone who thrived in the shadows. This is it, Michael said, his voice firm. He's here, or at least he was. We need to move in, quietly. They parked down the street, the truck idling in the dark. The canines were alert, their bodies tense and ready. Emily could feel her heart pounding, her senses heightened as she stepped out of the vehicle, Rex by her side. This was it. They had to get in, find something that could lead them to Kane, and get out before they were discovered. The building loomed ahead, silent and ominous. Michael signaled for her to stay close as they approached the back entrance. The door creaked open, the smell of mildew and stale air filling their lungs as they moved inside. They carefully navigated the dark interior, using the faint light from their flashlights to guide their way. Rex's nose twitched, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The canines moved with precision, just as they had been trained to do, every step calculated. We're getting close, Michael muttered. Stay sharp. As they turned the corner into a larger storage room, Emily's flashlight landed on a stack of crates, each one marked with a symbol she recognized. Blackwell's insignia. Her heart sank. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Kane had been here, moving Blackwell's assets, keeping them safe, ensuring that everything Blackwell had built wouldn't be lost. But then she heard something, a sound. Footsteps, muffled voices. Someone was close. Move, Michael hissed, pulling her into the nearest corner, and the canines dropped to the floor, their bodies still, their eyes fixed on the sounds ahead. Emily's breath quickened, her mind racing. They had to get out of here before they were caught. They couldn't risk blowing their cover. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably dangerous. Kane. He had found them. Michael's eyes met Emily's. There was no time to hesitate. They were face to face with the man who had orchestrated it all, and this time there was no escape. The cold air in the abandoned storage facility hung thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. Emily's heart raced in her chest as she crouched in the dark, her flashlight casting brief flickers of light across the walls. The canines, poised and alert, barely made a sound. Rex, her steadfast companion, stood closest to her, his nose twitching as he sensed the presence of the danger that lingered in the room. David Kane stood just a few feet away. The man they had been hunting for weeks, the mastermind who had stayed hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings behind Blackwell's empire. The one who had orchestrated the rise and fall of so many lives without ever leaving a trace. And now, Emily and Michael had found him, cornered him, and there was no escape for him this time. But this wasn't just about bringing a criminal to justice anymore. It was about ending the chain of destruction Kane had set into motion, about dismantling his entire network and taking back control of the city. Kane's sharp eyes scanned the darkened room, his gaze flicking from Michael to Emily. His expression was cold, calculating. He knew they were there, and he wasn't surprised to see them. If anything, he looked more curious than alarmed, as if he had expected this moment. "Well," Kane said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying edge, "I have to admit I didn't think you'd make it this far." Michael's jaw tightened. He was standing just a few steps away from Emily, keeping his body between her and Kane, the gun in his hand steady but unraised. "This ends tonight, Kane," Michael said, his voice low and unyielding. "You've lost." Kane smirked, stepping further into the room, the light from their flashlights illuminating his face. "Lost? I don't think so. You've caught me in the middle of my business, but don't fool yourselves. You can't stop what's already in motion. You think Blackwell was the mastermind? He was nothing more than a puppet, and you've just cut the strings of the wrong person." Emily's grip on Rex's leash tightened as she stepped forward. "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "We've already stopped Blackwell, and now you're next." For a brief moment, Kane's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading into something more dangerous. "You think you can control this city? You have no idea what you're up against. The power you're trying to fight against isn't just about money or connections, it's about influence. And that's something you and your little crusade will never have." "You're wrong," Emily repeated, the words slipping from her lips with newfound strength. "We've already won, Kane. It's over." With that, she glanced at Michael, silently signaling him to make their move. They had him cornered, but they couldn't waste time talking anymore. The only thing that mattered now was taking him down and making sure that his network didn't have the chance to spread again. But before they could act, Kane's smirk returned, even more malicious. "You think this is over?" he taunted. "Let's see how long you last then." In an instant, the sound of a sharp click echoed through the room. The door at the far end of the facility swung open and several armed men rushed in, their weapons drawn. Emily's stomach dropped. Kane had known exactly what he was doing. They were walking into a trap. Michael's hand went to his side, instinctively reaching for his own weapon, but before he could raise it, a loud bark interrupted the tension in the air. Rex, always the first to react, was already on the move. With lightning speed, he lunged at the closest man, his powerful body slamming into the gunman, sending him crashing to the ground. "Stay down!" Michael shouted as chaos erupted around them. The canines sprang into action, each of them attacking with precision, their bodies moving like well-oiled machines. Emily acted without thinking. The world around her blurred as she ran toward Kane, the light from her flashlight bouncing wildly. She wasn't going to let him slip away. Not this time. Not after everything they had fought for. Kane turned toward her, his eyes flashing with something between admiration and disdain. He reached for a gun at his side, but Emily was quicker. She slammed her shoulder into him, knocking him off balance just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed the wall beside them, sending a flash of light into the dark room. In that moment, everything became clear to Emily. This was it. This was the fight that would determine the future of the city. She wasn't just fighting for her own safety anymore. She was fighting for the people who had been exploited, for the innocent lives that had been destroyed by men like Kane. With a sharp breath, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard enough to make him drop the gun. Her heart thundered in her chest as she slammed him to the ground, her knee pressing into his back. The fight was over. Kane was no longer in control. "Get him!" Michael shouted to the canines, who had already subdued the remaining men. Emily's heart raced as she watched Rex and the others work with terrifying efficiency. There was no question now. The network was collapsing. The operation was being dismantled piece by piece. Kane writhed beneath her, his breathing ragged. "You think this is a victory?" he spat. "You don't even know what I've started. It's too late to stop it." Emily leaned in close, her voice calm but resolute. "No, Kane. It's over. You're done." And with that, she signaled for Michael to move in. Michael reached down, cuffing Kane's hands behind his back, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. As the police arrived to take control of the situation, Emily took a step back, her mind still processing what had just happened. The fight was over. Kane, Blackwell, and the rest of the network were in custody. The city was safe, at least for now. But Emily knew that it wouldn't be long before the next challenge came. The shadows never stayed quiet for long. But for tonight, they had won. They had stopped the man who had tried to control everything. They had saved the city, and that was enough. As the officers led Kane away, Emily stood beside Michael, looking out at the chaos around them. The canines had done their job, and now the silence of the night settled back in. "It's over," Emily said, her voice a little softer now. "Not entirely," Michael replied, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "But this was a good start. We've made a difference." Emily smiled, glancing down at Rex, who stood proudly beside her, his head tilted as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Together they had fought for what was right. And as the city began to recover, Emily knew that no matter what came next, they would be ready. The real battle had only just begun, but she was ready for it. Join our journey of growth, inspiration, and empowerment by subscribing to our channel. Together, let's create a community that stands tall, lifts others, and makes the world a better place, one story at a time. We'd love for you to be part of our family.